Good morning, everybody. Now we are going to have the first lecture that is talking about the first psychological crisis in modern China. When we trying to give the explanation about the economic crisis, we must relate or set the correlation with the geopolitics, especially in 1960 to 1970s. That is because after the Second World War, the US and the CSSR as a two big power never been settled their geopolitical controlling, especially in Asia. That is because Asia have long-term the history of a nation state. You know that China have at least 3,000 to 4,000 as a state history. I mean the history as a state or as a country. A country is somehow talking about the rural area, but a state means that you did have long-termly the governments and the governance. So for the long state cultural history, these countries in Asia never been fully occupied and fully colonized by West colonial master country. During the 300 years, I mean the modern 300 years is exactly the colonization history. And the American continental, both North and South, and Australian continental, these continents, and Africa, it's 4 continents, totally conquered and colonized by Europe or by Western countries. And that is to make Europe to be the center of the world. But long-termly, if you think about 4,000 or 5,000 years history, the center of the world is in Asia. So even after the colonization, Asia, especially China in Asia, still be the largest indigenous population country, never been covered by colonization, never been totally conquered by the colonization. So when we talk about after the Second World War, the new geopolitics taking place, these are 2 big country or big leading country want to parted the world. So they are very difficult to handle the issue in China. So last time when we talk about 1960s, we gave a concept to talk about delinking. And delinking means that fully independence. I very much emphasize from 1950, after the Second World War, the hot war, regional war, is Korean Peninsula. Caused by that, China parted from United States. So Second World War, there's a 4 country as a winner, including of China. So United States, UK, and Soviet Union, and China. And UK and US certainly set up a line. And Soviet Union set up a line after the Second World War. No, during the Korean War. After the Second World War, no, because that time the mainland China controlled by KMT governments. And KMT governments is originally joined the ally with United States and UK. So after Second World War, there's 3 winners parted from 1 winner. It means another part is just a Soviet Union, 1 country, it's a leading country. So after the Korean War, China close to Soviet Union. But just 5 years after 1955, there's a quarreling. There's arguments between these two ruling party. And then until 1960, when China parted from Russia, Russian retreat, all the capital and the technical service and technical support. And that means that China regained the fully independence, parted from these two big power. That is a kind of adjustment of post World War II geopolitics. And this keep going to the end of the 1960s, and then readjustment come. That is because of 1969. There is a very serious conflict. This is a border war taking place between China and Russia, between China and the Soviet Union. So caused by such kind of fighting at the border between these two countries, the border war made a historic opportunity to U.S. That time, if you think about this competition between these two leading countries, even U.S. have UK to be the ally, have the West Europe and Japan to be ally, to join the U.S. ally. But caused by the geopolitics expansion, and U.S. very much strong involved of Vietnam War. Vietnam War is the very big loss to United States, and then aroused a lot of campaign inside of U.S. So then, when you think about the competition of these two leading power, two big power, America at that time, U.S. at that time, in 1960s, seems less competitive as Soviet Union. So caused by such kind of situation, and U.S. need to separate China and the Soviet Union, because China and Soviet Union originally have the quarreling, and the two countries' relation has been broken. So it's a chance. After '69, there is a border war happened in Treasure Island in northeast China and the Siberia of Soviet Union. Gave the historical opportunity to United States, and that is many things changed. So we said it's geopolitical readjustment, and big triangle is United States, Soviet Union, and China. That is as a kind of triangle. So this a big triangle geopolitical readjustment is a kind of historical opportunity, not only for U.S. but also for China. And so this one should be a very important background. That by that, we need to know that China got a chance to absorb the Western capital to come to China, to change the Chinese heavy industrial structure. Originally, the industry is exactly for the military production, for the heavy industrial production. So that is not for the people's livelihoods, not for the market needs. So the domestic demand cannot be satisfied by the heavy industry. So that is China take the opportunity for readjustments, the structure of the domestic industries. So that is for different sides, they have a different opportunity for change. So that is why we talk about this big triangle readjustment geopolitically. And then to make China have the second chance to absorb the foreign capital and for readjust the industrial structure. But all of these readjustment have the cost. the cost turned to the economic crisis. That is a very simplified explanation about this lecture. Let's look at this the background. The background is that from the 1960s, last lecture we have this analysis. The overproduction is the internal contradiction from the capitalism itself. That is from Marxism. Marx, his thesis has been indicated. It's a contradiction inside of capitalism made the mass production and the little consumption. So overproduction must be happened as the crisis. That is the key issue. The capitalism cannot solve the problem by themselves. So in 1960s, the overproduction as a crisis happened again. And then Western countries have a lot of social conflicts, even the street violence. Many workers lay off, so they go into the street, and then there is a left-wing movement. That is from 1960s. So 1960s is a crisis everywhere, not only Europe, but also United States. And if you go to China, and China also have the crisis in 1960s. Beginning of 1960s, China have the crisis, and then turn to the political movements. That is a regulation. That is a kind of rule, political economics rule. So in the whole world, the political uneven, the instability, the social instability, anywhere, it's a very popular phenomenon. So the Western countries, these has been industrialized countries, they started to transfer out their manufacturing industries to developing countries or to these geopolitical controlling countries or areas. So that is the historical events that most of these developing countries or backward countries, they have the chance to take the industries, not by their own primitive accumulation, by foreign capital investments. So these are a kind of new model after the Second World War. That is FDI, foreign direct investment, to set up the manufacturing factories, workshops in these countries. So here we are trying to give the description about how it's implementation. And then in Asia, because of the Japan facing the same trouble of overproduction, so Japanese started to transfer out the manufacturing industries, labor-intensive industries, to these East Asian countries, like South Korea, like Chinese Taiwan, like Hong Kong and Singapore. So from 1960s to 1970s, these countries and areas, regions, all got the foreign investments, all got these factories, manufacturing industries. So and then, because it's these countries or regions is small, peninsular or even island. Well, Taiwan is island. South Korea is a half peninsular, and Hong Kong is a small island, and Singapore is just a kind of port city. So it's a very, very narrow area and very little population. So in very fast, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, the price of the land, the price of labor, most of these important productivity sector, all high price. The price goes high. And then these manufacturing industries cannot stand on the price, the productivity price increment. So they started to move again. So to do the analysis about such kind of phenomena, you need to understand such kind of FDI, foreign direct investments, to set up these manufacturing industries, is rootless investments. They cannot set up the root in any country. They're only seeking the low price productivity. So it means even you can have a short-term high growth, and people can have benefits from high growth, but it's just short-term, maybe less than 10 years. And then if you cannot upgrade or based on such kind of high growth, you do have the income. And then this income, if cannot use for primitive accumulation for setting up your basic industry, means that these rootless investments, foreign investments can flow out, flow to anywhere, and then you will have a large number of the people lost job, and the poverty to be more and more severe. And then the rich became rich, and the poor became poor. The gap enlarged, and then social instability also happened. So that is in these areas. If you think that it's they are the model. Originally in 1970s, they were named as four tigers. Oh no, there's a four dragon, four little dragon or small dragon, four little dragons. Because this dragon means that they all have a similar culture as the mainland China, and they have a Confucianism. So caused by the culture, because Western philosophy, they think that the Asian continent have no state, nation state. So they said you are civilized state. And then this country, the area, these regions, all covered by Confucianism. So they said, okay, you are four small dragon. And then another four tiger, a small tiger, is that also allocated in the geopolitical control area, like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. These are four small tigers. And also in Asia or Southeast Asia. In these areas, and it's a very strong relation with American military base, like Philippines. For facilitate Vietnam War, American built up very big military base in Philippines. And then you need to settle down the Philippines, these guerrilla movements. So you need to absorb these cheap labors for manufacturing workshops, for manufacturing industries. So for such kind of strategic management or strategic treatment, the Philippines and Malaysia also facing the conflicts with Malaysian Communist Party's guerrilla movements. So Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Thailand all have the peasants' guerrilla movements, and so they need to have some labor-intensive manufacturing factories, industries set up in these countries to settle down large number of the poor peasants population. So for such kind of geopolitical strategies, these four small tigers got the investments. So these are the frontier country or region. It's South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and Singapore. Singapore also have a very big American Air Force base and Navy base. So it's think about the 1960s, also caused by the after Second World War, the competition between these two allies, between these two leading powers. So there's many things happened. But the end of 1960, as I mentioned, the readjustment started. Look at this one. So the triangle relationship at the end of 1960s started to readjust. There is a key issue that is from the Second World War. American first used the nuclear weapon to bomb Japanese, destroyed two cities. And the nuclear weapon is a very important key issue after the Second World War. So these are two leading powers. All developed the nuclear weapons. and then to use the nuclear weapon as an umbrella to cover their allying countries. That is a nuclear weapon geopolitical computation. By such kind of computation, until 1960 and to the end of 1960, Soviet Union have the nuclear weapons much more than United States have. So means that both of Soviet Union and the US can destroy each other 100 times. Meanwhile, destroy the whole globe. The whole Earth means the whole globe will have the same end, same outcomes if they push the button of the nuclear weapon. So that is a very terrible balance. It's a terrible balance between these two big power. They all control large number of the nuclear weapon, means that they never allow each other to use nuclear weapon. Means nobody can push the button. That is the key issue if you do want to understand what happened in the end of the 1960s and the beginning of 1970s. Because Soviet Union, when they fight with China at Treasure Island, Soviet Union not win. Yes, they not lost too much, but just lost some 30 to 40 people, soldiers, and lost one tank, and not big loss. But at that time, to this country, especially to the leader, at that time is Brezhnev. He cannot stand. So he said he want to use the nuclear weapon to bomb China, to solve the problem. And at that time in 1960s, China raised up the slogans, anti-imperialist country, that is the United States, anti-revisionist country, that is the Soviet Union. So that time, Soviet Union leaders think that if Soviet Union bomb China by nuclear weapon, American would like to see that. So inform to United States. But the US think that it's a terrible balance. Any country can use. Means that will break the balance. So American disagree with Soviet Union. That is caused by make balance. So, but it's also American gave the information to transfer by another way. Give this information to the Chinese leader. Means that the China at that time, why they have the number one order to make all the political leaders separated to different area, and then to make these government departments and the military departments all out of Beijing, separated in different area. So a lot of people cannot understand why they sent even, Liu Shaoqi at that time has been no power, and after Cultural Revolution, Liu Shaoqi lost all the power. But even that time, Liu Shaoqi need to move to Henan. It's in a county. So Deng Xiaoping also in a county or in a factory. So almost all of these politicians, these political members, and these leaders, all need to send out. And that time also that I mentioned the third front construction, much urgent to accelerate the investments and the constructions. It's because of they are trying to prevent these political leaders, these departments, these factories from the nuclear bomb. So this is very dangerous at that time. So caused by these two countries' situation, United States at that time falling into the Vietnam War as a jam, cannot jump out. And then in United States, there are so many campaigns against Vietnam War. So American at that time seems less power than Soviet Union. So less powerful country wouldn't like to give the chance to this top power country to bomb China and retake China as a kind of follower. So that is a strategic thinking way. So they think that is a unbalance. So they disagree. And then China at that time as the third large country, as a power, is because it's maybe the third power, but it's not exactly. China also need to change. So the third one needs to have a new strategy to do something to strengthen their position, and then against the top one power. So at that time, the end of 1960s, the beginning of 1970s, Soviet Union at that time exactly the top power. The first power is Soviet Union. I said that the nuclear weapon, the number of the nuclear weapon doubled than United States controlled. And also they have done a lot of things and to trouble US. So that is that time the triangle is a kind of relationship, is a kind of strategic and need to be readjustment. So that is why we need to say that China, American have a reapproach, strategic reapproach, and by the dialogue in Warsaw, in Poland, by the ping pong diplomatic or whatever, it's a game, and then by Kissinger visit China, and then by President Nixon announced that release block China. Originally, American blocked China in the 1950, and then to 1971, 20 years later, American announced release the block China the policy. So and then Nixon come to China to visit Mao. So that is a big triangle readjustment, geopolitical readjustment, to give the historical opportunity to any side. Okay, so we need to have, this one also shows that the last time we gave this picture to show from 1960s, per capita real GDP downgrade. And then to make the regain the mass production in Europe and the Western countries got to transfer out their manufacturing industries. I don't need to give more explanation. And caused by the Western countries' overproduction crisis and transfer out their manufacturing industries, there are the story of 4 small dragons and the 4 small tigers. This story, why I said that is story, is because since 1980s, most of these mainstream Chinese officials and scholars believe this so-called tigers and dragons as a kind of development model. But it's not. Because from the 1970s, the industries transferred to these countries at that time all are so-called military coup ruling or dedicated system or whatever. It's not applied to the ideological propaganda. They said, okay, you must be a democratic country, you must be a freedom and whatever. Singapore at that time is criticized by West as a kind of dedicated system. And if you, no, sorry, if you go to, if you go to Korea, South Korea, in 1960s, this Park, General Park to be the president because he used military power. So, and then when they take the power, and then started to have the foreign capital investments. So the foreign capital invest into what kind of country? Into the military controlled country or dedicated system country and whatever. It's because it saves the transitional cost. You don't need to negotiate. because you are a strong ruler. You control almost everything. So these are foreign capital invest in your country. They don't need to have a negotiation. Military control is more easy to make the foreign capital have a benefits, have the interest. So that is South Korea. Originally in 1961, this picture shows that along the Han River, there are big slum. After the Second World War, there's a Korean War. Korean War after, there's no capital for the construction. So at that time, in 1950s, 1960s, South Korea is a poor country. So here is the slum. And then just 15 years later, and President Park have a kind of special strategy, developed this highway, along the highway from Incheon to Seoul. It's not very long, but it's easier for transportation. And then they built up a kind of industrial zone along the highway. So that is a typical South Korean experience. A lot of people talk about that, but indeed, it's by the military coup. By such kind of, it's reduce the cost of the industrial development. Easier to set up the primitive accumulation from the resources from the people. So that is also why, after that, after military coup ruling system bankrupted, and there are so many social campaigns in South Korea, and the whole society was more easier to be mobilized, to politicized. So nowadays, if you go into South Korea, you meet almost every people, they are very much keen on political issues. That is the Korean case. So just now, when we talk about Singapore, at that time, Singapore is just a 1 million population. It's just a kind of city society. So it's the people live in very hustled area, and easier for mobilization to join the labor-intensive manufacturing workshops. And then they have a very fast to have a primitive accumulation, and then Singapore set up the industrial zone. Inside, they even don't need to build up the highway because the port is just a city. City is the port. So it's more easy to transfer out and transfer in. So that is Singapore is a very small city. It's 1 million population, and it's easier to set up their industries. So, and let's go to next one. So at that time in Taiwan, still be in, how to say, 戒严, means that military control the time. So, and also because of they have got some state capitalist events that's from Japanese time, the Japanese conquered time. So Taiwan also in 1970s is only 10 million as a population. So Taiwan economy was also easier to take some foreign capital investments and then to have a high growth. Hong Kong also. Hong Kong at that time in 1970s, how many population in Hong Kong? So 3 million to 4 million, half as now. And so it's more easy to set up some factory and then to absorb some cheap labors and to make Hong Kong have a high growth also. So most of these small economy allocated at the border of China, mainland China, to develop them faster and then to give an impact to mainland China. That is also the geopolitical computation or geostrategic computation. So these experiences, we can say that it's a small economic areas experience could not or cannot apply to big continent country. So when we have such kind of model in 1980s, the mainstream scholar or politicians, they forgot. That is the geostrategies is a very important event. So they don't have the macro view to talk about the whole world situation. So they think, okay, look at this guy, or look at this area, look at Hong Kong or Singapore, develop very fast. So we need to learn as a model. But it's not exactly a model. They have a different background. So we need to give a more deep analysis. And when we talk about the ruthless investments, means that these investors seeking low price productivity for seeking the revenue. The revenue is institutional revenue. I don't need to give more explanation about what is the institutional revenue. You can go to search the internet, and then you may have the answer. I just see that the ruthless investments, not for the industrialization. And the ruthless investments set up these labor-intensive manufacturing industries can short time to have the returns. And these returns may be taken by the local authority or by some bureaucrats or by some departments, but mainly controlled by the transnational company. So nowadays, a lot of developing countries think that is a good model. They need to pay attention to my arguments. That is a ruthless investments. Such kind of capital could hardly set up any basic industries in your country. So that is not for your industrialization. It's just for short-term interest, short-term return. So it may be that will more harm your environment, your society. So because there's a throughout large amount of the institutional cost to the society and to the environment. So that is a we got to mention. So, but these are ruthless capital investments move to mainland, occupy the coastal China economy. They have a very complicated impact to originally set up the independent structural industries mainland. So mainland originally they have past several decades set up their structural industries. Nowadays, from 1980s to 1990s, very much impact by such kind of ruthless investments. They don't need you give them the machines, facilities. Everything they take from overseas, from outside. So you pay a lot of investments, you pay your hard labors, you tolerate a lot. You set up your perfect structure industries, but you cannot give any machines to these coastal manufacturing industries. Means that they cut the market relation. They cut the market. And then they said, you are not apply the market system. Right or not? So we need to take into consideration. So that is why I wrote something here, and then to try to make people to have awareness. And then we said the second part of this lecture, we are trying to mention that the foreign capital absorbed by mainland China in 1970s is still be maintain the independent industrial structure, not exactly controlled by transnational company. That is different model. I mentioned 4 dragons and 4 tigers. That is one part of the model. We need to deepen our analysis about such kind of model. What is their mechanism? I said it's seeking the institutional revenues not exactly to have the profit. Just now I have given them analysis. Now when we talk about China, at that time in 1970s, even China take such kind of historical opportunity for readjustment of their industrial structure. Originally, Soviet Union styles industries is a heavy industry and military industries, not for people's needs. But when they do such kind of readjustments in 1970s, at that time, the leadership still want to maintain the independence. So let's just absorb these advanced machines, facilities, and techniques, not FDI, not foreign direct investments, not transnational company direct come to China and to set up their factories and use your labor and your resources. No. We still have our Chinese industry, our factories, partially for repair or for upgrade the facilities. We need a part of the Western machines and the facilities, and then combining the Western advanced techniques. So that is we need to have some of the overseas facilities, not the whole. We are trying to reform. We are trying to readjust the structure of the factories. Means that we are trying to maintain not only the economic infrastructure, also we need to maintain the political superstructure, not change the institution, not change the system. That is 1970s. And then this 1970s change also not the same as the 1980s. 1980s quite different, but in 1970s, this change need to do more studies to know that how this independent country take foreign capital, but still maintain their independent sovereignty, economically, politically. So here I gave the analysis about the China's sovereign utilization of foreign capital different from East Asian processing and trade models. These models in East Asian, in these small tigers and small dragons, they are so-called foreign trade dependent economy. In China, not that time. That time it still be local demand dependent economy. So when we talk about such kind of geopolitical change, and we said caused by the geostrategy readjustments inside this big triangle, China got a kind of new historical period, means that we have a 20 years peace. Because at that time, the end of 1960, United States and the Soviet Union all make deal. Nobody can use nuclear weapon. So means that the terror balance has been set up. And so means that China avoid the nuclear weapon attack. Before that, China have 5 times to got the threat of the nuclear weapon attack, both from US and from Soviet Union. In the beginning of 1950s, it's United States. They want to use the nuclear weapon because of the Korean War. And Vietnam War also. Chinese-Soviet Union as a border war also. So we at least we can give you 3 cases. But we have a 5 times threat by nuclear weapon attack during 50s, 60s to 70s. And few people understand that why when China-Indian border war, China win. But why the China retreat from the border? And so it's how many kilometers? 20 or I remember it's 20 kilometers. Give up. They have occupied, but they go back. It's because of not just caused by the border fighting. It's caused by another side that is at the back of India. Somehow they are trying to deal with this conflicts by nuclear weapon. So if you going forward, that will be more troubled. So there's so many stories you need to take into consideration. I just give you a hint, and then maybe you have interest to do the further study. And so I said this in the 1950s to 1960s, American had made more than 800 assault China by Air Force or by the warship. And so there's also many border fighting, not gunfighting, but state beat up each other. That is many soldiers fighting along the Soviet Union and Chinese border. So many conflicts in 1960s and the 50s. But finally, from the Nixon visit China, and China believed that we will have a 20 years peace. So that is a historical chance for China reduce investments into military industries, to turn the very limited investments into the people needs, into the these commercial products. That is textiles, light industries, and chemical industries, fertilizer industries, whatever. So it means that caused by 20 years peace, they think that they predicted that we have 20 years. And then they change the investments point, they change the structure, and then started to develop the social needs and people's needs. This kind of commercial industries. So this it's big change. And also from the beginning of 1970s, even China still have the economic crisis, but the economic growth step by step goes up. So we can see the picture later. So when we talk about the second times to absorb the foreign capital, means that China this time will change the industrial structure. Originally, China used 2 decades to maintain Soviet Union styles, Soviet Unionized industry. I mean, Russianized heavy industry, military industry. That is a big cost to maintain such kind of no returns industry. Since 1950s to 1960s, you got to pay a lot. But this heavy industry, military industry, only can use into the fighting, into the war, the products. They produce a lot of gun. So that time, China facilitated Vietnam War. At least they utilized these products, and until the Vietnam War ended, they still have a large number of the Chinese guns and the bomb and the weapons, whatever. So that's they maintain the reason maintain this heavy military industry is because of the very tension relation with not only the border country but also with the imperialist country, with the revisionist country, with colonial country, whatever. So at that time you have so many enemy. You join the world class struggle. So you need to maintain the basic industries as a heavy industry, machinery industry, military industries, because that time it's fighting everywhere. But when they believe we will have a 20 years no fighting, no big war, China leadership make decision, change the economic structure, change the industrial structure. That is why we said it's a very important historical chance. So objectively, they do need textiles, they do need light industries, and the chemical industries, and the fertilizer industries, whatever. So, and the agricultural machinery industries, and so many things. So that's this Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai joined together to make a new project that is a $4.3 billion used by Chinese governments to buy the facilities, to buy the techniques from Western countries, to utilize this historical opportunity to absorb some machines, some systematic machines or facilities, and then to change the structure inside. So that is that time we need to know. And then also the strategy and the policies in China for this foreign capital is that it's take inside, and then how to say 引进消化吸收. That is these are three concepts. It's a very important. Means that to make it inside as your own, not controlled by others. So at that time, the transnational company have no power in China. So that is the very important, very critical feature, very critical issue in 1970. To make the difference of the 1980s or later 1980s or later 1990s, even now. So you must know that from that time is still Maoist time, still Maoism. Mao is very strong to emphasize the independent sovereignty. So that is in 1970s. You must know that even we have so many measures, but the key policy is that still maintain our economic sovereignty. Others can help, but you must be very, how to say that, 自主 means that self-reliance, and so and so. That is still be a kind of revolutionary country's thought. And then just when they started to absorb the foreign facilities, just 1 or 2 years, it's very, very easy because you have set up your structural industries. So buy these foreign machines, and immediately, very fast, 1 year later or 2 years later, they can produce a lot of new products to satisfy the people's needs. I remember this from 1973, 1974. We can have what is 底确粮. At that time, it's chemical textiles products, and female can have a nylon swa. How to say that? It's I don't know, but anyway, it means that stockings, and means that the women can show that how sharp they are. So these people's needs started to be satisfied. Okay, so and this picture shows that the geopolitical change. This one means that in 1969, at the Treasury Islands fightings, these are the Russian troops. They have a modernized tank and a jeep. Chinese soldiers only can use their feet, but they did very alert to protect the border. So that is from 1969. That is a border of conflicts, and then here is a Vietnam War. American have a lot of massacre, and then aroused the social campaign to against the Vietnam War. And that is why American at that time to be a second power seems weakened than Soviet Union, because domestic issue very much impact the American strategy outside. So this is Vietnam War. How many American soldiers' deaths? That is a World War II. That is a Civil War. So, and this one World War II, and then this one World War I, World War II, and then Korean War. But Vietnam War, the deaths of the soldier much bigger than the Korean War. So that is American Vietnam War soldiers come back. There's his dead body, and their family, their parents, is very sorrowed. Their children death in other countries. So that is most U.S. post Second World War. That is a casualties in Vietnam War. So that is why Americans have so many campaigns against Vietnam War, to give the heavy pressure to any politician, and they got to end the Vietnam War. But why that they are lost a lot in Vietnam War? Because Vietnam War at that time is sponsored and facilitated by both Soviet Union and China. And China sent troops to fight in North Vietnam, and then to save the military force going to the south. I mean the domestic military force of Vietnam going to the south. And the north, the protection of the north is as a job to Chinese military power. So they have sent troops to the north, not to the south. But south is a big fighting, mainly from the north. So that is also gave a lot of weapons. And the weapons also from Russia. So Vietnam War, they got two big countries facilitated, Russia and China. Even Russia, China have a big difference. They have quarreling, they have arguments, they have a lot of contradictions. But in Vietnam War, they joined together to facilitate the Vietnam War. So American failed in Vietnam War. That is easy to understand. So that is also why American need to part this relation between Russia and China. So that is why I said the triangle. Vietnam War is a kind of triangle competition. And so, and this one is that also the pictures to show that American international strategy constrained by the domestic issues. And then there's a so-called 嬉皮士, how to say that? Hippies. Yes, it's a movement. It's a social movement. That means that these young people wouldn't like to go to the war. So they burn out their documents as a soldier and then join the social alternative group. And many social chaos at the time. And then that is why Americans come to China. Here is Premier Zhou Enlai welcome President Nixon in the airport. Here is Mao have a dialogue with Nixon, but it side caused by the ping pong diplomatic, but it's just one case, not exactly the important events. It's because of the triangle readjustment. And then by utilize the foreign facilities, China have so many new projects. That is $4.3 billion in foreign capital. But indeed, is that a lot of factory they used some facilities. Here is a Wuhan iron plant. That is a picture to show that they have rearmed, refacilitized by these new machines. And then they have 13 chemical fertilizers program. They have 4 chemical textiles. They have 3 chemical, oil chemical or petrochemical system facilities. I don't know about this one, but anyway, they also have a three systematic hydro plant or electricity plant, and then 2 systematic iron plant project. So so all of these projects for food, for clothes, for people's needs, and will be 18th, and the total amount of the projects is 26. 18 is for people's needs, for food production and for the clothes productions. So that is the total amount of the money to the whole of the foreign capital investments is at 63.84%.